Hello and welcome. We are live. I'm the field CISO here at Fable. Jacob is my name. Please ask any questions as we go through this presentation, as we all talk here. We'd love to get audience participation. We can kick that off very quickly with, if you're watching this from somewhere, tell us where that place is. I'm sure everyone's somewhere, so let us know. Let's get into the topic. We're all using AI. We're well on that adoption journey. Many of us are actually deep into many production use cases, but we're still finding what the right business value is, what the right tech stack is, how to manage risk at speed. And in other words, we're really somehow flying through the air, drawing the blueprints to the plane, and handing them off to be built and assembled. And we still have a lot to learn about how we go through this. Today, we have two experts on risk management, Holly of the Cognitive Security Institute and BJ of SanDisk, who are managing these processes and helping others manage these processes. Welcome. Holly, would you like to do an introduction first?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm Holly Grayling from the Cognitive Security Institute. By day, I am a security culture and awareness lead at Tunstall Healthcare. So managing all things human risk at a global healthcare organization. I have spent several years doing this for different organizations across different industries. And as I just mentioned, so by night, I volunteer for the Cognitive Security Institute, leading all things human risk and looking after one of the special projects, which is AI cognitive defense for organizations. So I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation today.
Hi, I'm BJ Steffen. I'm the CISO at SanDisk. I've been in information security for over 2 decades. I've done everything from consulting to the private sector, to the public sector, to retail, to financial services, health industry. I've seen a lot. I started out early in my career and spent a lot of my career in breach response. So I've seen some of the best, the worst, and the bad ways to do things. I've also spent a lot of my time in internal, external audit, risk management, technology, done a lot with the technology stack. I'm very passionate about driving and enabling business through strong and smart security opportunities. Also a huge fan of human risk management, which is something I'm very passionate about, and seeing the opportunity to talk about human risk and AI and how the two merge. Really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you both. Let's start something that's maybe the most human part of AI is the emotion around it. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of energy. There's a lot of fear around AI, whether that's an individual, will this replace me? Like we have fear around that maybe day to day. We have fear as security leaders. Where are people sending data that I don't know about? I think we should start with that emotional topic. BJ, you actually recommended this during our prep for this. We talked about what should we talk about? How should we think about this? What is the lens that's going to be interesting? And we came up with a few good questions around like the emotion of it and the fear that comes with AI adoption within business for risk leaders. Let's start, BJ, with you, then we'll go over to Holly. Mm-hmm. From your side, what do you see as inside the organization? What are you seeing from a fear perspective? Like what scares people about AI during the adoption here that we're going through?
I think there's a couple things. I think there's a combination of fear, combination of anxiety, uncertainty. I kind of put it in a couple areas. Like one, there's the obvious one I hear quite often is people are afraid of that AI is going to take over their job. So I want to first be clear and say, I don't think AI is going to take over your job. But what I do think is that you have to understand how to use AI responsibly. And you have to be able to use AI. AI is not going to replace you, but the person that's competing for that same role that knows how to use AI will probably win out. So I think that fear of AI replacing you is just something that we got to get over. But the reality is it's here. So next comes this anxiety of like, how do I use AI? I mean, I see a lot of users that they're afraid of, doing it wrong and getting in trouble, and the security team's going to come after them and like, what did you do so bad? And they get that anxiety. I think it's really smart as a security practitioner. We got to lead by example. I spend a lot of time reaching out to, different parts of the organization and working with, my peers. Like, we should be demonstrating as security practitioners that we embrace AI. We know it's here. We're not going to be able to get in front of it and stop it, but let's show people how to use it wisely. So I'm a big fan of leading by example, showing people like it is okay, but here's the guardrails, here's the constraints, here's how you should do it. Here's what good looks like. And I always, some people almost get ashamed or embarrassed to say they use AI. I use AI every day. I've gotten to the point where I've changed the way I work because AI enables me to be smarter and more efficient. So I think we just got to embrace it, acknowledge the anxiety and fear, but figure out a way to get past it and use it almost as a fuel and a power to enable us to be better.
I love that. It's really interesting when you do lean in on using it, finding the strengths and the weaknesses, and then it leads to all these thoughts of like, how can I go and put some of these use cases in my business? So I'm with you. Leaning in is a great way to actually find the reality of that. Holly, what about on your side? What do you see from either your day job or the Cognitive Security Institute work from an emotional response to AI in the business?
Yeah, similar to the points there. So you've got the fear of the unknown for a lot of people, the fear of a steep learning curve, fear of replacement. Again, you have the other end of the spectrum. So those that have just jumped in, they've championed it, they've almost gone off the deep end to really try and understand it. Obviously, everyone has different needs and entry points to it. You might get the developer who starts to play around with it for their work. You might have someone in customer service playing it around just to help summarize emails or reword some content. But I really do believe myself as well that this will help free up people to use their expertise much more valuably. Instead of going through all these spreadsheets and doing a lot of the admin, actually could a smarter tool do that for us? And could we then use what your expertise are for to help in other areas? I think a big part of our role as well is being curious about the technology, as we've mentioned, finding those entry points for people. So rather than just saying to everyone, here's the tool, good luck, really understanding actually what different populations do you have in your organization? Where can they start small and start building up as well? And I think one of the big things that we need to do is celebrate success and learning from what also doesn't go as smoothly, because we do really need both lessons to learn. So that's something that I'm starting to consider of. It makes me think about the change curve that a lot of us are familiar with anyway. This is just another situation to apply that to. You've got some people that are on the denial kind of anger end of the spectrum, and you do have people that have already jumped in, they're using it, they're integrating with it, like you just shared it. Some people using it already in their day-to-day. I know I am. There's a lot of work for all of us to do. We've all got high demand, so I think there's some real valuable opportunities there for people to work smarter and not harder in places.
If I can just touch base on that, actually, I really like what you said about celebrate the success. I think that's so critical. And I think that, finding ways to not only celebrate success, in an individual stance, but also in that community. I like how you talked about how there's so many different people have different approaches. Some have done it well, some have not done it so well. And don't be afraid to share, almost like that community drive of like, hey, this worked for me, this didn't work for me, and recognize those areas where it is very successful. I always say it's great to kind of learn where somebody else fell probably in the wrong spot. Then I don't have to, but don't be ashamed to kind of share those opportunities and build that community facet of how to be responsible with AI. I think that too lowers that anxiety amongst each other when you can see your peers doing it and how they're doing it successfully.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Maybe from a trust perspective, a different set of emotions or a different set of thoughts we have, right, on the human side. There's an interesting conversation around AI in business around trust. What is the trust level that we put in it? And this goes to the security controls we use, the decision-making processes. Just how much does it feel like I'm interacting with something that has human-like qualities? We see it maybe on the social side of this where people put too much trust in it, where it becomes a therapist they over-rely on maybe, and you become over-reliant on this. But the same thing then translates into what happens in business, where something outputs something good once or twice or three times, and therefore we trust it moving forward, but we don't always validate. Let's this time maybe start with Holly. What's your reaction to that? What do you think about the trust problem that we have in AI?
I think because this is something that's 99.99999% replicating a human, how it's talking, it's always improving. And I really think having that understanding and approaching it with empathy to the users, wherever they are on that spectrum, whether they're under trusting it, whether they're over trusting it, and really starting to understand, humans have always done this as well. People aren't trying to be careless. This is how we are biologically wired, and there's a lot going on play on there. But I think again we see that spectrum of unhealthy versus healthy use and attachment. A lot of AI outputs appear credible, and you've got then what we call false familiarity. It doesn't judge people as well. So you think about someone exploring thoughts or questions, whatever the role they are. Actually, the system isn't, demeaning them, making them feel uncomfortable. Some systems, and there is that concern, maybe not even challenging the users back in a healthy, constructive way. We do have where some people might prefer a system that always agrees with them, for example. Or some people do want that kind of constructive experience that they're building. But this is where I'm starting to get really fascinated in that space, because I think it really varies between people's personal experience. Again, some of the what we've just discussed before around the champions versus those that are maybe a bit more wary of it. And then again, also what people are exposed to. We see a lot on the news about it taking jobs, or, people using these tools obviously on a very relational or therapist basis. And I think, a lot of those risks do translate into any organization. As I've said, false familiarity. You've got things like compressed curiosity, where they're just talking to the AI. They're not going any further. They're not delving into why have you given me that answer, not building up their own knowledge, not checking outputs. But then we also have something that's a byproduct of that overtrust in some aspects, which is judgment delegation. And for an organization, particularly with high stake requests, etc., that is really critical. So that's something I'm quite mindful of, that as we roll it out, it's not obviously just a technology issue. It's considering now, how will people use that? How will that influence, business decisions and certain forums?
Wow, trust is a loaded question, and Holly, you just hit a whole bunch of the key items. Let me see if I can touch base on a couple of those things. So I love what you said about the impact on business decisions, but let me focus a little bit when we talk about trust. I think there's a couple different areas it comes. First, it comes with the indirect trust. I like what Holly said about the personal facet of AI. I think we have to realize the way people interact with AI is personal. Mm-hmm. So we always have this first side that people have a friendship with an AI if they've used it in their personal life. They got their passion, whether it's Grok, Gemini, ChatGPT, and you're not going to change that because it's become a friend. There's an emotional attachment to that. And so you have to realize that that becomes a risk at the same time. Then we talk about unauthorized usage of AI. People feel familiar. They're going to talk to it. They're going to have conversations. Like you said, it's like their therapist. So that we have to recognize that indirect trust first, and that becomes a risk we have to manage from the enterprise standing, because you don't want them having a business conversation with the public Grok. That's not the way to go, but let them use that in their personal life and acknowledge it, recognize it's there. I think the other side, as we look at trust, it becomes this, even the trust of proper execution or responsible execution. We talk about engaging AI, and it comes back and it makes you feel good. AI and it makes you feel like you're the smartest person in the world. You can ask this question, like, the sky is green, and it goes, yes, the sky is green. Thank you for correcting me on that. And it's totally wrong. And so we get this concept of hallucinations. Now, hallucinations are far lower than they were a year ago. I remember a year ago from now, it was a lot of fun trying to see the answers. It was like the memes and the games of what AI would give you as an answer. It was awesome. So the hallucinations and this trust facet, you got to think of it differently. One of the things I've been using a lot lately is when working with generative AI, I say, think of it like your draft. It's your first draft. It's going to generate content. It's not going to be accurate. Growing up in school, if I wrote a paper and gave it to the teacher without even proofreading it once, I knew it was terrible and I was going to fail. That's where AI needs to be treated. It's your first draft. It does the bulk of the work. But then you got to verify, go back, check your sources, read it a couple times, make sure it makes sense, and then fix it and make sure, it's actually accurate. I think we go to the last piece of that trust becomes the overtrust. This is something that is an emerging threat right now in AI, especially in the enterprise and the security realm. And we look at agentic. So we get beyond generative, we get into an agentic, we get to this overtrust. We're like, you know what? AI is doing a good job, and I'm going to have it I'm going to have it start responding to my emails. First, we give it the opportunity to accept invites. And all of a sudden you got a meeting you didn't even prepare for because you didn't realize that the AI accepted it. Now you got to get ready for it. That's a very small piece, but that starts to get more and more of that establishment of trust. Eventually it's writing code. Eventually it's managing your database. And all of a sudden it makes a bad decision, which it thought was a good one, and it's caused an impact. Whether it's deleted data, whether it's rewritten your code, whether it's wiped something out, or whether it's made a commitment you don't think it should make. That overtrust is the emerging trust we really got to start worrying about. I think we're starting to deal with the therapists and the friendly and emotional relationships. We're starting to be smarter on the hallucinations. But now we got to this point where it's like, I love AI. It's doing a great job. It's making it. Sure, I'm going to let it kind of run and manage things, and it's going to bite you. And that's the part we got to also be worried about as well.
Maybe to take it, like I'm thinking through a bunch of things as I listen to this, but maybe to take it to something that's very tangible in our world, and then maybe we can go back to generic business examples after, but very tangible in our world, there's things like GRC, incident response, security operations, where we're looking at how we can use AI to make processes better. One area that, there's two areas I've spent a bunch of time in this, but one that I think is very tangible for the audience, maybe, as a lot of people are thinking about this, is on the SecOps side and IR side of things as well. Of what level of trust would we delegate during an investigation period? So if something goes bump in the night, we've, over the years, put in systems like SOAR and responsive technologies that are supposed to take action and auto quarantine based on certain indicators. But now we're saying we have this giant network that can maybe understand more indicators or reach out and then go and grab an indicator and then make a decision. And then if it makes the wrong decision and we isolate a production system, we've always had this problem in security ever since we said we do isolation. As soon as we could put a firewall rule in and say we're segmenting this thing off because we had bad signal, when we made that human decision, we still were held very accountable for it. But now we're saying, can we delegate that to a machine? Should we delegate it to a machine? I thought we could pause here for 1 minute because it is something I think the audience might really understand through their day-to-day of how to make these decisions. And whoever can start on that. I have my thoughts, but I'll go last on my thoughts there.
I'll jump in. So I'm very passionate about security operations. I've run a SOC multiple times, run more war rooms than I even want to admit to. When we look at that trust of automation, you have to first, so I'm going to hit two sides. First off, you got to hit from the business and the executive level, know your risk tolerance. Know what are you willing to tolerate as a potential impact, because that'll then drive the second side, which is knowing where you want to trust it to execute. So as you look at your risk tolerance overall, and I love the example of like, quarantining a system, you got to know at what point you're going to have to get to the trust. I'm going to be very clear and say, we have to get to the trust, because the machine attack, the speed of a machine attack nowadays, so what's going on with mythos and fables, and we can go down those rabbit holes later, but the reality is the attack speed is so fast, we have to rely on machine for response. But now what level is appropriate? What is your risk tolerance for impact? And this is where there's two principles that one is an old school principle, which is trust but verify. So if we've been in cyber for even a day, trust but verify is going to come up in the conversation. Trust but verify. So trust what you want it to do, but verify. And that verification comes to the other concept that I think everybody's starting to hear a lot, another buzzword of human in the loop. So when you look at where's your acceptable trust execution, if you're going to quarantine a person who sits on the help desk and their machine, they happen to click on some sort of drive-by banner and they got to quarantine their system, who cares? Quarantine that thing and let the machine automate it all you want. But if you got a system where somebody is running a manufacturing floor and it's got a piece of malware on it and you quarantine it and you just lost a 6-month production, yes, that might be a human in the loop. So I think there's a gradient as we look at security operations. We look at what level of trust and automation. We have to understand that, and you have to be able to control that. That is something from a SecOps. And as we look at automation and delivery and AI, you have to control it. You cannot avoid it because you're going to need the speed. Otherwise, you're always going to lose. But you got to know where can you control and have the right insertion of human in the loop to make that decision for you.
Yeah, I completely agree. This touches on something I've discussed before around because we need to start somewhere, and I think there's also so much noise that people are quite worried. Where do I start? Where do I begin? And just as you touched on, understanding those high stake requests, areas, critical processes in your business, the systems, those dependencies. Obviously, that always built on a foundation of understanding what is going on, where those dependencies lie in the business. I know that that's a task quite often for organizations, is just to get cohesive sight on, these operations and understand where these kind of pinpoints are, and then starting to make decisions based on that, like you say, that kind of phase process, and where you really do require human in the loop, not just from, a technical automation side, but, human processes where they just could be using AI themselves, rather than, agents, etc., moving around as well.
I think one of the other facets on this goes back to resetting the way you evaluate the risk, resetting the way you evaluate the impact. Because if you look at it, a conventional approach that we did years ago, you're missing it. You got to look at the reality of today. Because, the speed, like I said, on the speed of execution. So you got to start to ask the harder questions. What is the impact we're willing to tolerate? What is it that we're willing to be okay with? Because if we don't move fast enough, that impact could grow and be far more substantial. So one of the things that I often encourage is to open the dialogue of resetting risk management, looking at it from a different lens, looking at it from a higher level of what the tolerance is and a lower level in which the speed is, understanding, hey, we got to move faster, which means we're gonna break a few more things, but we need to protect what's critical. Like Holly said, know where your critical stuff is. But you got to reset the denominator of risk management now, because we're dealing with the new pace, we're dealing with the new reality, we're dealing with the new attack vectors and the attacker themselves. It's not human versus human, which it has been for decades. It's machine versus machine. And if you're trying to go human against machine, guess what? You're not in the right way.
It's interesting, and I think it's a really good segue into another topic on risk here that I'll bring up in a second. I think it's actually where I see the biggest failure mode in security leadership, whether that's manager all the way up to executive CISO level. More people in business have a higher risk tolerance than what we in security often believe is the right risk tolerance. And that's where a huge amount of communication breakdown, I think, occurs between other executives and security leaders, where we believe our job is always to educate, like, this is the risk. And it is our job. That is part of our job for sure. But I think that there's that breakdown of what is the risk tolerance levels that we have as a business, like what type of failure modes are tolerable versus not tolerable. I think often as an industry, this is an overgeneralization, of course, but as an industry, we often lean too far into the intolerable. Every risk is intolerable. And that, back to the trust thing that we talked about, erodes trust with the executive team when we're trying to communicate with these things. And I'll tie it back to AI and then maybe switch topics or let you guys respond, then we could switch topic a little bit. When it comes to AI adoption specifically, for teams who have, I feel like, had communication friction around this before, the security teams are being invited as much into the room for AI adoption conversations because the security team has had friction with the leadership in the past. They know they're going to introduce friction into this process, but the business opportunity that's viewed right now about AI adoption is so great that any amount of risk to some is tolerable. And this causes us to definitely have anxiety on the security side, because we know what happens when you say any risk is tolerable. To us, we go, that's going to lead to an incident because I've lived it. I've been there. I've been in that war room where we said any risk is tolerable. So it's interesting, because I do think it's something that as an industry, we need to be a lot smarter about how we communicate these things. And I'll leave it there if you guys want to respond. Otherwise, I'll move us to the next topic, but I'll leave it there for you guys to respond.
I just think it's always a challenge. Yeah, that's something that I'm hearing about. You've got that businesses want that competitive edge. They want to deliver with pace. They want to use AI. AI is already available. None of us had to approve it. Anyone can sign onto a website at any point. Free, a free account. That's it. Your staff can use it whether you like it or not. Then obviously trying to keep up with that. I think, again, it's just our job to try and get in the right forums, to try and break down those silos, to try and work with these broader teams, because it's just another topic that reminds us that we can't just be working in security alone. Like you say, we need to understand that there's a bit of give and take, I think, on both sides. We realize that we need to support the business in their deliveries, but the business needs to realize that actually if we can go in at the entry point by being more secure by design and adopt that and try and get it in at the start, it's always better to be proactive than reactive, as we're starting to see with some of the stories that are coming out externally.
I think AI has been a great example of getting to the right conversation, like you said, because when AI first came out, the reality was in every CISO conversation I sat in, we all realized there was one consistency. We're not going to stop AI. There's no getting in front of that freight train because it's just going to run us over. And so it became the question of how do we make sure we're in the right conversation, and how do we guide it? How do we redirect it? Jumping in front of it, you're going to get plowed over. It's done. The business is going to do it. There's going to be more and more shadow AI that pops up. But if you acknowledge that, and I think as CISOs and as security practitioners, we've come to realize that we do acknowledge AI is here. So now we're saying, okay, look, you're going to go use it, but can we at least have a conversation about how to use it smart? Let's talk a conversation about how to be responsible. Okay, so you want to use a model, but don't grab an open source model. Here's some models that we've put controls in and we put technology in place. If you want to use AI, don't go use the Grok personal one. No, let's go use that one. Don't use the Copilot consumer edition. Let's use the enterprise edition. I think as security practitioners, we have to get to the table. And, I don't think I'm not running into any executives that are not willing to have the conversation. They all are. But as security practitioners, the absolutionist of just stop using it doesn't work. So you got to bring in your policies, you got to bring in your guidelines, you got to bring your guardrails to redirect that freight train and move it in the right direction, and help it find the opportunities. And so I think we're there, we're having the conversations, but how we have that conversation is how we're going to win.
I think that's you accidentally did a really good job of the segue into what I think is the good topic here, that we had talked about in our prep for this, which is risk segmentation, role-based risk segmentation, role-based enablement. When I say enablement, I do mean both teaching through awareness, teaching people what to do in that, but also how do we address by role the different capabilities we dole out to people based on the risk threshold. Let's start, Holly, with you, and then we'll go back to BJ. Holly, what do you think when it comes to enabling the business around AI? How do we measure risk by role and capability, but then how do we enable by either role, risk threshold? How do we look at that, and how do we successfully go about that? And how do we what's our failure modes that we should avoid too?
I think it's starting to understand, again, as we've talked about those, so I like to call it like high risk roles. So those kind of roles in the business that are higher risk, whether due to their exposure or the impact if something went on, starting to build up use case profiles, so understanding how these different areas of the business are using it. So you've got, what comes to mind, you've got your executives, you've got your developers, you've got your finance team, you've got your HR. That is kind of at a high level. Obviously, what it depends on per industry and organization could really vary. But then you understand, just like you would with any other training, what is the relevant things to their day-to-day activities? How are they going to use it? Back to my point earlier, where someone who's a developer will be using it differently as someone who's, in HR, for example, and the risks associated to them might vary slightly. There are a lot of common patterns and a lot of common trends that run throughout them all. But some might be more, you might be concerned about some more things with an executive, judgment delegation, for example, or data loss because of the secret kind of work that they're utilizing, versus, as I said, a developer. You might be concerned that they're just completely vibe coding and they don't understand the backdoors that have been put in. They're putting their code everywhere and everyone's got your IP, and that will then start to inform your approaches, what that approach looks like. We know that formal learning alone does not work. It does establish a foundation for people, but back to some of the earlier points made as well, the social element is massive with this. So understanding and seeing that their peers are doing it. Also, when you think of those that are leadership and those that aren't, that they're seeing leadership model these behaviors. They're seeing a culture around psychological safety built up where they can have these discussions around what's working, and what's not working. So nothing kind of is in isolation, nothing's hidden. There's no one just sat on their own trying to tackle this, which for me broadens the risk out because you've got no sight. Again, trying to then measure that. I think it's always really interesting on what people give you when you ask them directly versus what's going on behind the scenes. I think AI is just one of those spaces where some people might be underconfident, some people might be overconfident, some people might not want to tell you and pick the right answer in case you fire them for what they've answered. And then obviously matching that up behind the scenes. And that is a massive challenge, is around data capability. I think we all struggle regardless to get basic data tidy and clean. And I know there's not anywhere really that I think there's, kind of achieved it to the vision that maybe we all have. But that's really starting to pick, what can you measure now? Where does that, align with the value? What are you needing to build up over time? Some organizations haven't got sight on what AI tools are being used, let alone trying to then understand how do we measure and understand if someone's overusing it. How do we understand if a developer's putting things in it that they shouldn't have? So I think by understanding, you do your analysis, you understand what's where these role profiles, or maybe you don't call them role profiles, whatever you want to call them, segmentation, the works. And then you can start building that up over time. So you've got, as I said, laying those foundations through the formal education. You've got the social acceptance and the peer-to-peer learning, but then giving those opportunities to practice what they're learning as well. Because without practice, something that I'm always mindful of is that we design a lot of things for the perfect conditions, and nothing really often is perfect in the human world. And then when you've got the pressure, so that's why, like you say, the tabletops and kind of running things like that, I think something organizations have to ask themselves is, we typically do tabletops around themes like ransomware. What about involving now AI related threats and situations, so people can start practicing it under pressure, and trying a few different ways to get their heads around this to start them on their journey. This is never a one and done for anyone, and I think that's what everyone has to be really mindful of, that this is the new forever. This is like the internet's arrived, and actually we now need to help people build up their capabilities whilst building up ours alongside them. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on looking at segmentation and what we can start doing to look at measuring that.
I agree. I think the key message is that when you look at roles, when you look at the risks of how you deal with AI, it's tailored. It's not customized, it's tailored. You have to understand there's a difference. Everybody's got a different approach. There's a difference, like you're saying, there's a difference in skills, there's a difference in knowledge, there's a difference in how people use it. And so I think as we start to look at how we manage and measure risk, especially AI risk in human action and their roles and what they do, you have to acknowledge that up front. And, I think as we start to design those controls, we have to make sure that as we design those controls and we design the policies, acknowledging what their roles are. A developer has a totally different role than somebody in finance, and how they interact with AI is going to be separate. And if you can acknowledge that, and if you've got the capabilities, the technology to design the roles to meet their needs, it's even better. That's where you've got to figure out, how do you get to that visibility? And we may talk about in a second on visibility, but get to the visibility. What are users doing? What's their interaction? Are they using, the first and foremost, are they using the right approved AI solutions? If they're not, that's another conversation. But then understand what their needs are and design the controls to meet it, and design the AI solutions to meet it. One of the things I've been trying to work on, and I'm hoping the industry can get to that point, and I'm trying to build some, if I can, internally, but also looking for a solution, is what I refer to as kind of a risk score. As you look at human interaction, it's just like, think about how we all have a credit score here in the US. So in the US, your financial, you have a credit score. It's about how responsible you are at, financial facets. Can we get to a AI score, a risk score for the individuals? Do they make smart decisions? Do they not? At some point, you got to get to the visibility. Are they putting the right prompts in? Are they putting in prompts that might lead to a bias or not? Are they making the right decisions? Are they using the authorized solutions? Are they enabling it? Or, We may or may not get into tokenomics, but we see all this token maxing where it's like they're using AI to make it look like they're using AI. That's not the right approach. Are they using AI to get value? But I say all that to come back to the concept that the risk of role-based is individualized, it's tailored, and we have to acknowledge that. So if we could get to like a risk score on a human basis to say these people are a higher risk of AI, these are lower, and then even to tailor some of the controls based on that. It's a utopia I don't see available yet. I think there's a lot of different solutions trying to drive us to where we can get to that visibility, build that out. But I think that's going to help us get a better balance. The other thing I would bring in on roles, though, is you look at that on the risk side and you start to manage the controls, is you also got to look at the blast radius. If somebody's got access to global admin across your entire domain, that's a large blast radius. That's a different risk value. If somebody's only got access to, answer the telephone and support, tech support, it's a different blast radius. Equally, where if you have an executive versus the lobby receptionist, there's a different blast radius of what their impact can be. Those are all factors you got to roll into how you're evaluating those roles. And then it just becomes a matter of what technology and the ways you've got to implement the controls to support those roles. But it's not blanket across the board everywhere and equal.
I have a tactical example, and maybe we can do a couple tactical examples for the audience as well. On our side, I feel as we look at risk, I'll share an area where I think the outcome enables sort of better self-governance, which is on the sales side, right? If salespeople are enabled to use AI in their role, their risk of doing something wrong it's there, right? Like they have access to customer contact information, customer data that is protected, it's regulated, PII. But that trust in the quality of the AI output highly is tied to their success as an outcome as a seller, right? So by enabling them, giving them the right tools, by allowing them to do the right things, they also self-govern a little more, because if they create a bad quality output, their management is on them, right, about that. And it also impacts from a sales perspective, right? They're impacted based on how much money they can earn if they do a bad job. So there's some self-governing. On the opposite side, where I've in multiple companies now have felt the risk around this one, that's a little harder to manage role-based wise, is developers side of it. It's the hardest one to manage because the productivity impact of an engineering org can have such a significant negative on the business if you over tighten controls. If you are too loose on your controls and too loose on what you do, they have access to some of the keys to the kingdom that you have to wrap in the exact right way. And as you introduce AI into these processes and how you build your CI/CD pipelines and how you do these things, there's a lot of thought that has to go into that. And some of the self-governing doesn't always happen as much there, I find. They try, this isn't a criticism of any developer or anything. But because it's just a total different reward structure as well. And so I think there's some psychology that goes into what is the behavior people perform. Then in that case, from a security team, what do we need to then go and enable role-based? But I'd love the examples that you guys have. BJ, maybe you have one in a similar stance, being someone that manufactures things that maybe you can share, maybe you can't. And Holly, you have one maybe like on PHI, right? That might be interesting to share. Again, if you guys can't share examples on those, I'm just giving out ideas.
So I do have a good example kind of in a similar dichotomy. So we look at, here's the development. So you're doing software development, you're writing code. It's a very obvious example for AI right now. You've got it both in the developing the code. People are getting into source code less. AI just writes the code for you. But you're also using the AI to validate your code, make sure it identifies vulnerabilities and you're fixing and patching those vulnerabilities. The entire control set in which you apply to that individual is different than, say, somebody in finance. But I'm going to get to finance in a second. So when you look at the developer side, you got to make sure you understand how they're writing the code. Is the automation there? Is there secure coding? Is it using the right practices? Is there over trust and execution? Is the tools that they're given to even manage the environment? What's the balance of agentic versus just generative? And so I think there's a whole different perspective. Now we take the opposite and look at somebody in finance. Finance deals with tens, hundreds, maybe thousands of spreadsheets after spreadsheets after spreadsheets. And you can think, well, what's the damage of a spreadsheet? Well, they're in finance. That means they're going to have to deal with their financial statements. Now you talk one of the biggest things, one of the hot button for every CISO out there is materiality. All of a sudden, you've got a material misstatement because an AI generated the wrong pivot table, used the wrong spreadsheet. It's like 700 spreadsheets, and the human knows, well, use this one, but don't use that one. But AI doesn't know that difference, and all of a sudden, it pulled a wrong number, or is an invalid spreadsheet or different reference. But you don't see that. So now, when you look at the controls you have to implement, the impact, the blast radius of somebody in finance could be vastly even more substantial when we start to talk about a material misstatement versus somebody is writing just maybe some software to support automation within the company or within the factory floor. So again, understanding the roles and looking at how you implement those controls and implement the education. You're educating a developer far different than you're educating somebody in finance. Their skills differences and capabilities, they're just two different environments. So hopefully it gives a kind of a good dichotomy of how you need to address the roles.
Yeah, just to build on that, so kind of similar thinking, just applied to different roles. So when I think about some in the organization I work for, you've got people that are in our response centers. So they handle critical care. They're open every day of the year. They're on shift-based work, and their average handling time is 90 seconds. So they're already moving very fast. They're in a very controlled area. They don't have the same level of autonomy as some of us. So, they're restricted to what they can do, how they can do it. And I think, again, it's back to understanding the areas. It's back to making sure that you know what these people need, how this is going to fit within their working environment realistically. I think some of the challenge for organizations is things get created up here and they get delivered into the workforce and into the environment, and it doesn't have the success that you were hoping for because actually it's meeting real world day-to-day conditions. And if someone is able to get something done quicker through something else that gets the pressure off them, allows them to move on, they aren't doing it to be malicious. They're doing it to get through their day, to get the job done. The biggest thing we have to consider as well is that time impact. When you've got things like a fast-moving operations, we are asking people from a human aspect, pause and verify, to check, to understand and to kind of kick that system two thinking in, which is a bit more slower, where all the work that a lot of these most employees and us live in is our system one thinking. So we're moving fast, we're just following patterns, and actually now trying to go, right, okay, well, it's already out there. How we need to integrate it into these operations to bring the benefit for them, because that benefit might look different. There are obviously things that we don't want. So particularly in the health space, we don't want to be giving health personal data to unapproved tools. We don't want it to be misclaiming facts. We don't want it to be generating outputs that are influenced by anything. So again, really trying to slow down and understand those various use cases, and then where, whatever you do with your people, your processes, your tooling, whatever controls that is, how can that support in regards to delivery? And this is where my start small and then scale out, I think, is really key, no matter where, because again, we could just go, right, we're going to change everything now. AI is going to summarize all your calls, it's going to help you write all of your emails, it's going to speed you all up, and then suddenly launching all of that at once. We all know that AI generated write-ups aren't 100% accurate, especially when we're considering things like accents or just a poor line, or people talking in high stress situations, and then again, you wouldn't want it to always already as a starting point be making these decisions without any oversight, to be sending emails out without any oversight. So I think from us, it's again, no matter the industry that you're in, is if you're working with health data, you're looking at that. If you're working with finance data, you're looking at that. If you've got, every organization's got secrets and confidential information and internal information, and I think a lot of us are scrambling to get the policies in place and to get tooling tested quick enough. I think that's a big challenge as well, is testing things to understand whether they're right to fit in these environments. But again, the best thing we can do is lean into these areas, as mentioned at the start, and really work with them. And that might mean slowing us down as well. But by getting that better understanding, trialing small and building out large, hopefully then we're not delivering something that's just gone too large at once, too overwhelming for everyone. And then when you're working in high risk areas or highly regulated areas, that could obviously cause you a lot more trouble down the line.
I like to try to keep these to 45 on the as close as we can, at least. Vijay, do you want to respond, and then we can all go around and give one leave behind for our audience?
Well, there was one more thing I wanted to mention on roles, and I just remembered, and I wanted to make sure we bring it up. There's a role we have to remember has just come up. That's the role of the AI itself. So we keep talking about the humans, we keep talking about the people. We cannot forget that the AI itself is now a role. This becomes there's a conversation I've had with a lot of my peers, which is, how do you embrace agentic, understanding the role? And there's kind of two different ways of looking at it. You can either go to delegation or impersonation, where the AI acts on behalf of an individual. That's always my recommended approach, because the other option is you designate the role as the AI itself. It becomes independent. It's its own account, it's its own user, its own service account, whatever you want to call it. Those to me are far more dangerous. And so I think we have to remember that AI itself is a new role we've not dealt with in the past. Sure, you could say we've had service accounts, we've had applications, but they weren't making decisions. Now we have a role making decisions, and that's a role we're going to have to manage against.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, actually. I think this is just something completely new to scope, to understand. And as I said, it's definitely not a one and done topic for everyone. So yeah, the more we can help each other and support each other, because that's what we're doing as well. We're just trying to learn as we go, as we guide people within our own spaces. So, always there to help anyone.
Awesome. Let's go around, do takeaways for everyone. I'll do mine real quick while it's in my head from what you just said. But I think other leaders, other people in the business are, to maybe quote Finding Dory, our friends, not food, is something that we on the security team need to often remember, right? Like, we need to go and talk with these people, understand what are they trying to do with AI, what's the outcome they think they're going to get, and then how do we help? Like, how do we go through all of this stuff that we talked about on the security team? Make sure we have the conversation so we understand going in. So that'll be my takeaway, and then we'll go around the horn here.
I definitely echo that. I think it really is our responsibility now to use this topic to push ourselves out there even more into the shadows, to not be the people that just jump out when we're telling people off, to bring people on that journey, and to consider everything broader that complements the technology. So not just technology, but the people side of it as well, and around how it's influencing all of that. I think there's one of the big takeaways today that we're all trying to figure out.
So if I were to leave a takeaway, I'd say, as security practitioners, if you're not using AI as part of your daily routine, you need to fix that today. Go out there and start using it. You have to use it. You have to experience. You have to see what it can do for you, so you understand how to protect it and provide it to the company. And I think what you're going to come to realize is AI can be hugely beneficial. And so as you start to see the benefits and you start to leverage it and you start to see how to do it responsibly, you're well positioned to guide the rest of the company. You're not going to be able to block them, but you can guide them, show them how good it can be, build an AI that they want to use. Like, the best way to stop shadow AI is to build one that's better. Nobody's going to go drive a Honda Civic if you got a Porsche you can ride in. It's like, make something that's beneficial to the business, entice them to use what is the right approach. But you've got to see it firsthand as a security practitioner. So if you're trying to fight against AI and you're trying to get up against that onslaught, you got to change it today. Embrace it, use it, understand it, so that you can help the company leverage it and protect it in the future.
Amazing. Thank you both for joining us today and spending a better part of an hour with us and giving all of your wisdom and knowledge to our audience. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.